Well, welcome everybody. It is a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you very much for taking time out of what I'm sure is a very busy week, as it does seem to be for most people that I talk to these days. We really appreciate you being here with us. We're hoping this time is just a very useful time, informative. We're intending it to be more of a conversation than a formal presentation. We just like to take some time to share some insights with you. So I'd like to begin, first of all, and most importantly, by acknowledging the traditional owners, both of the lands that I am on, the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation, but also acknowledging that each of you comes from many, many different lands. You've lived on different lands, you've journeyed in different lands, and you've got history with many different lands, and they're all represented here today, and we're all gathered from many different places, many different stories, many different traditions, many different people, many different languages. And we acknowledge that history, that deep, many thousands of years of history. And we acknowledge that some of that history we're only just beginning to learn or relearn, as the case may be, or get in touch with, or learn to listen to. And it does form an important part of our work in learning to listen to First Nations. So we acknowledge the history, we acknowledge elders, we acknowledge story, we acknowledge land and place, and we acknowledge their importance here. So we're just really grateful you could be here with us. I'd also like to acknowledge some people who can't be with us today, which is our two co-chairs, Penny Dakin and Jane Hunt, CEO of Aracy and the Front Project, respectively. Unfortunately, they couldn't be with us because they're not on lands, they're up in airplanes. And we haven't quite worked out how to crack that one yet, but they do send their regards, and looking forward to catching up with some of you afterwards. And also acknowledging Emma Sydenham, the Director of Early Childhood from Social Ventures Australia, which acts as the project manager and backbone support organization. So those three organizations form the governance of the Early Years Catalyst, along with our leadership table members who are the founding members of the Catalyst. We just want to quickly acknowledge our funders, who without this, it simply would not happen. The HP Foundation and Alan and Jill Gray Philanthropy Australasia for their amazing support and sort of, I guess, visionary support in funding this startup and getting things underway. And particularly now, we just want to acknowledge our speakers panel that are going to be with us today, the ones that we're going to have the conversation with. So we've got Orange Compass, who were the lead consultants on this project, which we'll get into in 1 second. And the team, Eve and Fiona, are here, which is really exciting to have them with us. But they've also brought with them some of the other organizations that work with them, from Social Enterprise Finance Association, Renee Martin, and Center for Child and Community Health, Rebecca Fry. We've also got some of our expert panel members, Bree, Nicole, and Anna from Mid-Coast for Kids in Taree, Early Learning in Gowrie, and Kwinana Early Years Service in WA. So we try to capture a little bit of a wide perspective. So really grateful to have you with us today. We're going to go back and forth with different parts of the conversation and explore different ideas. There is a Q&A that is going to be running, and you can get that, and please feel free to post anything in the Q&A. Just acknowledging the other members of the Backbone team. We've got Bree, who's driving Zoom, and Michelle and Sal, who are helping us wrangle the Q&A. So they'll make sure that they filter up, and we'll cluster those. We'll go to questions at the end of our conversation, and hopefully by then, some themes will have emerged from the questions and answers. So if you have an idea, if you have a concept, you want something to be explored further, please just put it in the Q&A so that we can then follow up and have a bit of a conversation with it. So that's the intent of today. We're here for an hour. It's lovely to have you with us. What I'd like to do now is, I've just introduced them, but calling out Fiona and Eve, who are actually going to kick things off for us, and they're also going to help us with calling in the panel and the different pieces of the work that they held or they specialize in. And I want to say, when we first conceived of this little project, and we're calling it evidence for action, or what it says on the webinar title, what works. It really came from that sense of when we went and did the systems mapping workshops, and even Fiona were actually heavily involved with that with their team. They were driving the work. all of these ideas started emerging. People so passionate about, oh, we just need to do this, or make sure you do that, or oh, if only we could have a, and then insert idea. And there was all these ideas that came up, and some of them were definitely of the hobby horse variety that had been well ridden and were highly trained. Others were just sort of straight blue sky, comets from out of nowhere that can. And we said, well, what do we do with all these ideas? And so the thinking was, and this is as I say, our funders were quite visionary. We said, we need to dig into these. We really need to dig into these ideas, because it feels like in the early years field, we've got ideas, but we're not 100% in agreement or sure of exactly what the basis is for doing the work or how the work should be delivered. And as the early years catalyst, we founded on the idea that the earlier summit way back in 2020 called for new ways of working, ways to change the system, working together, and we've been working to build the evidence for how we change that system. We thought actually taking some of these ideas right through to examining them is a really critical piece. So great idea. We turned around, and I want to introduce the people that actually made that then a reality with us and helped us deliver that, because it sounds easy when you say that. Oh, let's just go and figure out what actually works. Yeah, well, if you say it quickly, no problem at all. Let's just take all the good, bad, and harebrained ideas and everything, the things that create energy and the things that terrify us, let's put them all together and let's consider them. That was the core inception of this work. What do we actually do to drive that long-term change in the system in the early years? I want to apologize right at the beginning. If you've got a hobby horse that's parked here today, if you've got a special project that you're passionate about and we don't mention it, or we are a little bit negative about it or something like that, it's not personal. We don't want to offend anyone. What we really wanted to do was just be rigorous and explore and call this the start of a conversation, to say, this is what we know now. What do we need to add to it? What do we need to discover? What do we need to explore on top of it? So please don't fire up if you're worried we might have left you out. We'd love to continue that conversation and explore those deeper ideas and further ideas and ideas that can be built on this. This is only just the very, very start of a lot of conversations. So if I can put that out there in terms of setting the tone, it's lovely to have you here. And let's now go to Fiona and Eve. Fiona and Eve, when we kick that ball to you of saying, here you are, here's these 72 wild ideas, somewhat reduced down to 72. What are you going to do with it? Tell us about where you went with it, how you approached it, and how we've ended up where we are now, about to launch the findings.
Thanks, Jeff. Hi, everyone. I might have first crack, and then Eve can help respond to this. And apologies if I talk too much. For me, the process of how is the most exciting part. What was really interesting about this project was a couple of things. One was trying to rank or assess leverage points. Actually hasn't been done very often anywhere in the world. So from a systems point of view, a lot of people work and identify leverage points, but it's very rare to find a method. It was actually really hard to find any methods that were a robust ranking process. So we had to tackle that. The second piece we had to tackle was, what do we mean by evidence? And so in conversations with all the project partners, we really explored not wanting to privilege formal desktop literature over other forms of evidence. And where we landed, summarizing a whole lot of conversations, was let's draw upon what we call convergent evidence, which basically means we're bringing across from multiple perspectives. And so the project was designed to bring in insights from the field. So that's frontline practice, knowledge and wisdom, from families, so that's lived experience, home environments, end users or beneficiaries of all sorts of service systems, First Nations, particularly culture wisdom, but also really different ways of thinking and knowing and doing and being and thinking about this whole space. And then we also looked at the formal, which is the published literature. And what we found, and when we did that, is we have a wonderful expert advisory panel, which we drew together 12 sort of leaders, practice leaders from across Australia who actually helped us do this work. We created a whole method for how we would think about leverage points, which I won't go into yet, but I will get into it later, and really thought about what would it take to actually answer this question in a way that privileges different types of knowledge. And Eve, I was thinking you could probably speak to here a bit about in that then the next step we had to do was actually think about how do we take 70 ideas and even turn them into any sense making. And if you like, I can share that cluster slide perhaps.
Sure. I think the clustering process, so we had these 72 fantastic ideas about what it is that would bring about, you know, real transformative change in the early years system. But 72 was going to be a lot to try and go through this sort of fairly detailed process with. So we went through, before we sort of took it out to everyone, we went through this process of clustering the leverage points and found that through doing that we could distill them down really. So what you will see here, if you're familiar with the systems mapping, are those sort of concentric circles going outwards from the child. And so what we ended up with was a cluster of leverage points that sat around communities and families in the driver's seat, a set that were firmly at reimagining the service system, a cluster around shared accountability for children's outcomes, and then a cluster around shifting society's perspective. So they were a sort of broad range of leverage points, and from a systemic perspective were aimed at sort of various different types of leverage point. But this gave us a really useful way of working through the many ideas that were sitting in that large cluster. So that's what we ended up working with. And then went through a process. It's been one of those processes of finding what it was we were looking at, coming up with how we were going to do it, what sort of evidence. So it was this sort of very multi-layered process of thinking about these leverage points, and I guess looking to find out more about what was likely possible, and then bringing all that information together.
So can I just jump in here and ask the two of you a quick question? So, you know, one, these are a broad range of ideas. They've come from people within the field. They've come from people very much at the coalface, or from families, from people who are, you know, interacting. It's not always, some of them are from the normal people that we'd expect in consultation, but a lot of it is from sort of not the usual suspects. So it's a very broad range. But, you know, like I started the conversation talking about sort of ideas that are generated, and you talk about leverage points. What does leverage points mean? You know, I know in systems talk and people that do systems change, you know, they'll be really comfortable. I'm just aware there might be some people on the call who sort of haven't heard that language before. How did you get from what people were sharing about their ideas to this idea of leverage points?
It's a great question, and apologies for the jargon. So a leverage point essentially is a place to intervene in the system. So we would say it's an opportunity, it's a space, it's a place where we might want to nudge the system. It doesn't necessarily tell us how we're going to do that. That's the thing we can experiment with. But what it can tell us is where. And so the examples that we'll talk about today are quite broad, and they're intentionally so, because once you identify a leverage point or a space or an opportunity to play, part of the work after that is all sorts of experimentation and testing and adaptation in how you might do that. So each of the, we landed at 18 in the end, and each of them are really high level opportunities to shift systems.
And what within the sort of body of research we did are case studies that are examples of how people have attempted to sort of bring that leverage point to life or to activate it. So there are sort of specific example of how it could be done.
So I'm really interested from the point of view of the work. You mentioned that you drew on First Nations experience and input. I know you're going to talk more about what you discovered and kind of how you got into it. But I'm really interested. We've talked a lot about First Nations first, and I'm really interested in actually right at the beginning to bring that into the room and ask that conversation of, are there any key insights that you developed by having a specific stream to engage with, test, gain insight from our First Nations colleagues and First Nations families and people who live and work in that space? Can you share anything there that would you'd want to bring into the room?
I think there were both. Overall, it brought a very different perspective because it's very live. So everybody we talked to had very strong examples from their own experience, which was really interesting. So there were and really kind of concrete examples, both of where the system does work and even some about where it lots about where it doesn't work and some about where it does work. But also offered this sort of insight or a glimpse into a very different way of thinking about children's development, about families, about the sort of relational work, and this sort of glimpse of how it's possible. And so certainly I think for me, that was one of the most striking things, was the sort of possibility that is there and the wisdom that is sitting in the sort of experience. And certainly a number of the case studies are focused on First Nations community sort of responses to challenges, and they are remarkable in terms of how holistic they are. So lots of the things that were asked for and the vision is sort of there for a future state for everybody is embedded into the way we heard First Nations talk about family and community.
So tell us more, sorry, and I did interrupt you, but I'm just really, to me, it's really important we get that in. There are alternative perspectives, and it did bring those new ones are really critical. But you then, you've got your clusters, you've got them set up, you've got them, they're now leverage points. They're not just a bunch of ideas. You're looking at the system. How did you figure out like evidence and what's good and what's bad, and was it a color matching theory, or tell us a little bit about what did you get into?
Well, this is actually, I'll talk a little bit about the process perhaps, but I'd also, I don't know whether I'm putting anyone on the spot from the expert advisory panel, just how it felt to be part of it. So one of the things we created was essentially an assessment framework. And again, apologies for jargon, but essentially from a systems view, a leverage point without understanding the system it's in makes little sense. And so it's really important that you consider a range of factors and linked things when you're considering a leverage point. And so we essentially had three levels in our assessment model. One was around the idea of the leverage point itself. So things like the potential impact, the scale, the desirability for families, the potential cost, whether it shifts the dial on equity. Was a whole range of pieces around that. Then we had another level, which was around the wider systemic context. So that it considered things like existing momentum or appetite or readiness, the level of potential disruption that a leverage point might create. And, you can derive from that both whether it's transformative, but also whether it's likely to trigger resistance, the enabling conditions that would need to exist for it actually to be possible, and also unintended consequences that can cascade out from that leverage point. So that was a lot. And the final piece, the third level, was really thinking about key actors and agencies. So it's critical in any systems change that we're thinking about the level of agency, authority, and capability of those who are seeking to create change. And so we really tried to walk a line between being sort of robust and, I guess, technically correct, but also really trying to tap into and understand the insight and lived experience. And I will say the 2 days that we spent together with the expert advisory panel and the amount of knowledge that they generated pretty much blew out of the water even our sort of 4 or 5 week desktop review. the amount we got in that 2 days from people with lived experience of the system was phenomenal. And I'm not sure here whether I can tap anyone on the shoulder, whether Nicole, maybe I can pick on you, or even Bree, just to say, what was that conversation like, trying to grapple with those different parts of it, trying to understand the potential impact of a leverage point?
I'm happy to jump in. And I think from my perspective, coming from a particular part of the system, I think what was really beneficial was the ability to build on different perspectives within that expert advisory group, because we all have different experiences of the system based on where we're sitting in the system. And I think that was really important to understand, that there isn't actually one way of seeing the system, that there are it's really important to hold those multiple perspectives across as we move through that assessment framework of the leverage points.
And I'm happy to add to that. I think what surprised me was just how different communities experience systems so differently. And to look at that within a broader systems context was really insightful. You tend to come to these discussions with your own experience of the system, but then to learn that others, even where it's a universal system, experience that so differently depending on their context. So I guess that brought various layers to the discussion. And I think that, sometimes I think leverage points you thought based on your own experience would have greater capacity for disruption. When you heard the voice of others, it really gave you a robust and rounded view.
And maybe just to build that story out. So we had the 2 days together, and essentially we were very mean in that we forced this ranking process on everyone, even though we recognised that these were the top 18 leverage points. So these leverage points were the ones that came out of the desired future state for the system. They're all good and they're all potentially really powerful. What we were trying to do was assess right now in 2023, right now, what would be the most impactful at this point in time. And so it's a really important caveat to say this was an assessment based on that. And we also then paired it with an open online survey. I think 210 people, including I think a third were family members, filled it out as well. And obviously the First Nations conversations. And Jeff, if I'm not hogging the microphone too much, if I hand it maybe to Eve just to say, I guess we talked about how surprising it was, how similar the results were. Did you want to speak to that at all?
Sure. I think it was sort of one of the magical things about it was a rapid prototype of a process, and we went into it genuinely not knowing what the outcomes were going to be. And so what we found looking at those sort of, I guess, bringing together different voices and different perspectives was how consistent certainly the top 5 or 10 were, that there is this sort of consistency, whether you're sort of academically expert, whether you're on the front line, whether you're a family, whether you're an interested person, that there are some very consistent views about what it's going to take or what it is that will be transformative for the early years system. And so where we had gone in thinking, oh, this might be interesting, we might have 4 totally different perspectives. In the end, what we had was actually quite a consistent sort of set. That, just to give a sort of a hint, are the ones that focus at the sort of deep systemic, the kind of foundations of the system. So it wasn't that we had, half of respondents or half of people saying, oh, if you only do this thing, that'll, fix it right up. It was people identifying the kind of the deep structural and sort of mental models that it will take to shift those things around.
So just picking up and reinforcing. So you've got leverage points, which are ways to change a system, ways to change either a part or the whole of the system. They're the ways to exert leverage. They're not necessarily just some hot idea. They're really fundamentally about how do you change that system around children. Going right back to the original call of the earlier summit saying, how we're doing stuff, actually, it's not getting the changes that we all have the ambition for it to do. We're not helping the kids and the families that we think need to be helped in the way that we think they need to be. We've been doing the same things. We're doing great things. We're doing exciting things, and it's not moving. How do we actually nudge, fix, move, change that whole system? And that's the whole call. So leverage points, ways to move it. You're looking at them in terms of their ability to move that system, looking at them in terms of the context of the system around early years, which is like, and I know because you guys were involved, we did the landscape atlas of, hundreds of pages of just the jurisdictional description of the different ministries and government funding streams at all 3 levels that are involved just in the early years. It's a massive complex system around early years in all the subsystems. Talking about the people that are involved, you then had these groups, sort of a formal assessment of all of that. You had your field, you had families inputting it, you had First Nations inputting it. So you've got, experts and lived experience and alternate viewpoints all coming together, and you're collating that. I'm really interested in, like, what were the big ahas? Like, did you find a silver bullet? Did you find the thing that's going to change everything for everyone? It's easy, and we only need $25 to do it. Is that there's no 3-word slogan at the end of it all here?
Wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't that be nice? So again, to keep everyone on the hook before we give you the answer, the step in this process, the sort of from the ranking, another step, as Eve mentioned before, and Beck and Renee are here, was a very rapid desktop review to look at where does the evidence actually lie for each of these leverage points. And maybe we'll talk about that a bit more in a moment, but the challenge of then looking for documented evidence was quite tricky, and a lot of our case studies end up being international, and some of them are not even related to early childhood. So to find evidence of, for example, shifting mindsets and how long that takes, we looked at different examples. So that's the caveat in terms of when we make some observations about how long, how much money these things will take. It's some of that's drawn from those different case studies. The other caveat I want to share with you is, and Jeff, I'm so sorry, I don't have a silver bullet for you, is when we mapped the linkages between the 18, and we'll share the list in a moment, they're so tightly linked. So there are clusters, there are natural clusters, and we comment on this. There's a summary document which sort of says, if you do 5, 10, and 20 together, they'll actually deliver you a package of change. So no silver bullets, but some really powerful clusters. And I'm wondering, again, with the caveat, I guess, of where we got to with this, we might do a show and tell, a little bit of a reveal of the scoring around the rankings. Does that sound okay to you, Jeff?
That does. I must admit, when I look at a diagram like that, I think what you've shown me is that it's complicated. Like everything affects everything else. And that is actually part of the answer, is that if we're going to apply leverage to the system, you have to recognize that there's lots of things that need to, so, everything everywhere all at once, to use to quote a certain movie. I mean, that's what we're actually looking at there, because there's so much joined between those leverage points. They don't. And
what we do observe is there are some which are what we would call quick wins. Most, I don't think there was a leverage point that could be done in less than 5 years. So it's all more than one election cycle, which is interesting. There were some that are safer bets. There are some that are less resource intensive. So we've tried to go, depending on what you're looking for at your moment in time. I mean, it'd be great if all different actors, everyone could do all of them in different ways, but recognizing there's some realities around that. And again, we can probably pull out some highlights from that. But if it's what we're going to do is,
sorry. I was just going to say one of the big ahas, which probably shouldn't be an aha, is that along with there being no silver bullet, there is no one party, no one sort of set of actors that can do it either. That where we did find evidence of how these things have been done in either different sectors, countries, sort of other circumstances, it takes a coalition of the willing, in the sense that it takes a group across sectors, across levels, to bring about this sort of level of change. So it's not a question either of saying if only government did X, Y, Z, even government can't do it on its own.
Yeah, and probably one other aha, just at a high level, was around the fact that we categorised the types of shifts within the leverage point that would be required. Things like changing the rules of the system or the structure, connections, etc. And the one that was most common across all leverage points was actually addressing the role of actors and connections across the system, including who has power, what roles and who has seats at the table, and what relationships are getting created. So there are common threads across them as well. Sharing the rankings here is a little bit scary because, like we said, there's all sorts of caveats around it. But what's really exciting is particularly the top three, the top five actually. It feels like the process worked. It gave us one from across each cluster. They all did rank as fairly transformative. And there was a high level of agreement across all the different ways and types of evidence that we looked at. So just maybe to explain the top five here, ensuring all children and families have their basic material needs met spoke to this idea of what would it mean if everyone had housing, if everyone had health, if everyone had education, what would a system need to be where that was true? And so that got into conversations about tax and welfare and all sorts of different things. But it's a really fundamental shift, and it speaks to that broader cluster around how do we share responsibility and accountability. Leverage point 12, enforcing accountability for outcomes for children and families. This is not just government's problem, but it was saying there are currently no or few mechanisms that are actually outcomes based. A lot of the system is set up based on a fundee, service provider model that is about outputs and KPIs in a different way. And what would a system look like where it was actually outcomes actually held power? The third one, ensuring service systems are staffed by high quality workforces. This actually spoke to the value of education and educators and teachers. So it wasn't just about money. That wasn't the sort of conversation here. This conversation was about, imagine if, an educator was paid as much as a brain surgeon, or imagine if we actually valued and had a different way of thinking about this. The fourth and fifth, the leverage point 1, granting greater decision-making power to the local community level, was a really important word around power. So decision-making power, not just consultation, not just integrated services. This was actually about how would you genuinely put community in a decision-making seat. And then the conceptualization or framing or approach to care was this whole sense of the sense of cost and burden, and even the time and effort it takes, or the amazing frontline work that's done that's about care, trust, relationships, and us actually valuing and seeing all of that as a benefit, not a cost. So they're just some of the examples of how this came through. I might stop screen sharing there so we can ask the others their aha moments as well. I don't know, Beck or Renee, did you have any aha moments you wanted to share?
I'm happy to kick off, Beck. So for me, being part of this was an absolute privilege. CIFA is an organisation that thinks about capital. We don't tend to think about systems change and leverage points. But what was amazing for me, the aha moment came with just the confidence to not let perfect get in the way of good, and to go, we're all right to prototype. We'll draw on the evidence, as imperfect as it is in some cases, that exists, acknowledge where there are gaps, and listen, most importantly, to the field, because it might not be in a peer-reviewed paper, but it's actually really practical and meaningful on the ground. And so I think there was just a real braveness to kind of start with these enormous suite of opportunities, and then somehow, develop a methodology and rigor around it, and create energy and get the right people to the table to start really exploring that, as imperfect as that is, because that's pushed it forward. So that's good. And for me, the other kind of really important thing to reflect on was one of the insights that's in the report when it comes out, which is around just starting with a step and then the effects snowball from there. So I just draw kind of back on the point that you made Fiona, around all 18 of these leverage points are opportunities. Obviously, there has been some ranking done, but moving one and then thinking about the sequencing impact associated with that is really important. So stepping into a step, whichever that is, because the convergence of all of the actors is really a tough ask, but moving there and then committing to sustaining the transformation. It was really important that we reflect on that from my perspective.
And I think also what was made clear is just how many examples of innovation are out there across communities, and how limited opportunities are to actually share the learnings from those innovations. You know, and I think this is where university partnerships with communities are important as well, so that we can start to gather the evidence and share the evidence around what works in communities across Australia.
I think one of my aha moments was really around key actors. So, I mean, the others have sort of spoken a little bit about the complexity of evidence assessments in complex systems change. And I think this process is really thoughtful and considered and has dug into these ideas in a rigorous way. But where do we go next? And I'm really left wondering about, so how do we as a field, as a system, come to think about the role of different actors, their agency, their authority, their capability to take the next steps on contributing to some of these leverage points, and what might the role of the early years catalyst be in helping us around this as we move forward?
So, yeah, I'm having aha moments as I'm listening to you talk, and you know, it's funny for me. I'm sure people who are listening must be as well. And I want to point you to the Q&A box if you do have any questions. Either we can, you know, if they're too detailed, we'll follow up with something specific. But you know, other people might be holding those questions. We'd love to answer them. But I'm really struck again by the sense of, you know, if we want to shift the things that are holding current conditions in place, if we really want to make fundamental changes, it also requires fundamental changes to how we think and how we operate. You know, I'm hearing you reflect on saying kind of current practices, current ways of operating, current things are good. They get us so far, but they're not getting us to that point of actually leaning in and really fundamentally changing the system. So you know, it's actually being not, I'm reminded in an early piece of work where we reviewed all of the evidence that we could find around the early years, what had been generated so far about change. We just did a very quick desktop review, evidence review. And one of the things that emerged from that is how, I think it was 92% of everything that was written about how to make things better for children, it was all written addressing either federal or state governments. So it was always, that was the assumption. Now, obviously they hold a huge influence because of the level of funding and involvement and policy, but also recognizing the role of the field and groups like this and many more to actually work differently and work in new ways to bring in new voices and new things. Am I hearing that right in terms of sort of what you're unearthing? That there's this more complex thing about working together collaboratively in new ways, which, you know, I know you said, Eve, it kind of feels like we should have known that because, you know, we've talked a lot about that, but sometimes that feels like something's pretty straightforward, but it also feels quite tricky to lean into. You know, it's a lot of new ways of thinking.
What's really interesting was taking the results of this work and going back to the earlier system mapping work and looking at particularly the current state maps. And what we looked at is there are reasons why this hasn't happened, because there are a whole lot of deep system forces currently at play that are pulling in the other direction. And we had all sorts of examples of that. So leverage point 1, which is around granting greater decision-making power to community. Essentially, that's that power sharing and decision-making of community. It challenges a whole lot of current state forces, which are communities aren't to be trusted, things done locally are less professional than things done nationally. The identity of even the service system, I'm being controversial here about seeing itself as a solution as opposed to community holding the solution. Leverage point 15, which has become a society that prioritises the well-being of all children. That was essentially this idea of how do we make child's well-being everyone's responsibility, and imagine a world in which community, a lot of the services might not even be needed because there was functional communities in operation. Again, there's a whole lot of deeply held beliefs from the system mapping around families are private, they're a no-go zone, the idea, sort of erosion of the village, the individualization, and even the diagnosis, there was an avoidance of big levers of change. And Jeff, you mentioned the rapid mapping. When we did that work, we mapped a whole lot of position papers and what types of leverage categories. So things like whether they're disrupting resources, power, mental models or other. And I think, as you mentioned, we also found something like over 80% did not talk about power and relationship. And yet, when we did this work, every single leverage point, that's a critical part of the success, would be addressing power and relationship and addressing some of these deeper power imbalances, which are, you know, part of the mental models and everything else. So it does really speak to us thinking about more money and more services is not necessarily going to fix anything. It might make things temporarily better, but it doesn't turn some of these forces around or break some of those patterns. So, Jeff, I definitely think that's right. Again, maybe it's controversial, but it does speak to this. It's kind of exciting too, because if we're naming it, then we can change it. I think that's the other thing that's really exciting.
I just noticed Bree had popped a question in the chat about how do you suggest communities use this information about leverage points to positively influence systems. I'm going to answer this because I thought about it just before. And I was thinking if I were seeing in a community and open up what is, no matter what form the final report takes, it is a massive amount of information. How do I sort of look to it to find things? And I guess my perspective is that if you think about what it is that, what are the issues that are facing your community, what are the particular challenges in your context, and have that in mind as you look at the list of leverage points and think which of these speak to the things in our community, which things do we think would make a big difference, and then dive into the resources that are in there. What it does have is not only a specific case study, and we had to pick, you know, one of, in some cases there were lots of options and in some there weren't so many, but there are also a whole lot of references to other thinking that's going on, other examples of where it's happening. So, you know, dive into the ones that look like they might be useful and sort of follow the trail. And my other reflection was, from a field perspective, or if you're working in community, one of the things that we found is that, as Fiona said before, is that there are a lot of things where there is not a lot of evidence and there's not a lot of written sort of reflection on what's gone on. And so that sort of openness to sharing your experience and what you found. And one of the things that there was a particular gap was people not, and understandably, given the current system, but there wasn't a lot of what hasn't worked and why not. And there's as much to learn from that as from what has worked. And so I think looking both to others to learn more about how they've had a go at addressing this, and also being open if you're, you know, in a position where you're doing things differently, to sharing that.
That's great. And I'm just noticing, I think some people are having trouble putting questions in the chat. I think you had pressed the little Q&A button. Bree, I'm Hancock, I'm tapping on your shoulder here, but if I'm right, there should be a little Q&A button somewhere and you type it in there. So it's slightly different to a normal Zoom call. It helps us keep track of the questions as well.
Yeah, it's in the it's at the bottom. It says Q&A, and it's not like a normal Zoom because it's a webinar. So yeah, and that's why you're not seeing thousands of people with dogs running through the background of their homes either. So yeah, it's a slightly different version of Zoom. But thank
I'm
you.
noticing there is a question in the Q&A around measuring outcomes for children. And this, I wanted to answer this in a way that builds on what Eve said, which is, so the question is, do you have any outcomes frameworks that are child-focused that can really support the shift towards child-focused outcomes as opposed to service outputs? So what I did when I saw that question is I quickly went into the document and I was like, what leverage point was that again? What number was that? And I had a look at what case study did we use. So I was just going to screen share to show you, and this is definitely not the polished product, but if we're looking at accountability of outcomes for children, there was an example of an outcomes benefit bond and a framework that was used there. So each of these different pieces that we have, we've tried to just put in as much information that we can around, you know, practice, enabling conditions, risks, all the things that we found. And then there's case studies as well with examples where we can give you something in that. So that's just one example, some of the social impact bonds, but others on the team might have also in their trawling through all the things have come across other frameworks of use there as well.
Just what people are thinking, I think that then highlights in terms of you know, publishing this and the structure. Do you want, I know you covered it before, but we've talked a lot. Do you want to just hit again on how we're actually going to publish the findings and make this useful, how it's going to roll out over the next sort of few weeks as we get things through the graphic designer and proofers and reference checkers and permissions from case studies and all the people that have been involved in the contribution. Do you want to just run through that again, or others are sort of thinking about any frameworks they might have?
Sure. So we had a big list, as we mentioned at the start, around all the things we wanted to consider around leverage points. What that led to when we created the documentation was there's the ranking part and then there's the desktop review part. That includes both literature that we could find. We had a benchmark for evidence that there needed to be some sort of evaluation or some sort of way to justify its inclusion. There's a lot of brilliant documents out there that don't have evidence in them, unfortunately. There's a lot in Australia that is not evaluated, so that's why it's not in there. But all that being said, great job, but we ended up with about 400 pages. So we are just going back through, we've written a summary, which is essentially the highlights of the key findings, including what I flagged before about, you know, thinking about the quick wins, the safe bets, etc. We've also written a separate methods approach, just a short document, which tells you more about the assessment framework. And now we're just going back and we're essentially trimming back, and we're going to publish them by cluster. So essentially each cluster will get a set of leverage points and case studies. If you remember right at the start, we talked about the 4 clusters, children and family in the driver's seat, reimagining the service system, shared accountability, and societal shifts. So they will be coming out. So the summary, my understanding is that should be ready to go before the end of the month. The other documents are in working form, and I imagine that's going to take us a little bit longer to get out the door, but hopefully, I don't know, if we can get it done in July, that would be amazing. But it could even be early August. But again, if you want to troll through 400 pages, just let us know. You're welcome. You can give us some feedback as well. I've just noticed a question in the chat as well, which is, can you share any helpful evidence from the review of what are the most effective strategies to enforce accountability for children and families? What was really interesting is this linked to another leverage point. So this linked to feedback loops. So there was a leverage point around creating feedback loops from community and families to government and service providers. And it also linked to reforming culture of measurement and evaluation. So there was actually a whole cluster around the forcing outcomes. One was around what are we measuring and how do we measure outcomes? And the other was there is currently a broken feedback loop. There is a missing feedback loop where government and service providers are both not hearing the reporting from community on their expectations around outcomes and the results of that. So there was actually, both the reforming culture of measurement and evaluation, enforcing and creating new feedback loops, and performance measures that are community driven were 2 of the key strategies around accountability. It was actually a really interesting little cluster of leverage points there.
It was also one of the ones, I had a particular sort of fondness for the change in the culture of measurement and evaluation, because I think if you're focused on outcomes and that's what's being funded, we might see very different sort of outcomes. What was interesting was it also came through really clearly from the First Nations perspective about really how unhelpful our current sort of approach to measurement and evaluation, and therefore accountability, is that basically it doesn't measure the right things and people aren't held accountable for the right things, and they're not the things that matter really. And so people can get big ticks and meet all their KPIs and it not make a difference, whereas it did, as Fiona said, linked into a whole set of others that if you had different perspectives and community voices sort of defining what is important and what the outcomes need to look like, and then there are accountability measures built into it, then we might see real differences.
I know I've said this before, but just so we got 7 minutes to go. I just reinforce, I put it in the chat. Please don't use the chat button. It's disabled because it's a webinar. Anyone can come in from anywhere with an open email address. It's a Q&A just as a safety precaution, because we don't want anyone posting anything dubious into the open chat. So it's just something that happens with webinars as a protection piece. There's a Q&A button at the bottom. Please use it. We'd love to have your questions in there. As we're kind of going through, I'm really interested in hearing from you in the panel. You know, like these are big concepts. They're complicated. Hard, you know, we're thinking over years. You said all the ideas are over an election cycle. You know, we're talking multi-year, multi-party, you know, multi-agent, multi-actor, multi-organizations. You know, we've got to work better together, lots of that stuff. But if I've only got a limited time, and I'm sure everyone here shares that feeling of, oh, it's just, you know, it's so intense right now. What do we do? What can we, is there anything you were mentioning before, Fiona? You know, you said, oh, you know, some things are kind of quicker wins, and there's some things that are more complex. You hit on some of the 5 top ones, which feel like really big pieces. But is there anything that's a little more, I guess, tangible, or things that people would want to put their shoulder to quickly or now?
Interestingly enough, some of the quicker wins and the safer bets sat in cluster 1, which was community in the driver's seat. There's a whole lot of natural alignment to where momentum is, where the appetite is building for place-based lived experience, etc. So, for example, if you were interested in that sort of both quick win and relatively doable, leverage point 1 around greater decision-making power to community, leverage point 2, which is fit for purpose funding and commissioning approaches, which would actually respond to and create more individualised responses in community. And then leverage point 4, the feedback loops from community and families to government service providers, all challenging, all would challenge vested interests, would challenge government and service providers, but there is a whole lot of goodwill and appetite, and there are also a whole lot of place-based approaches trying to do this. So they would be relatively safer bets. The other 2, leverage point 6, which is around recognising families and those with lived experience as experts for the purposes not just of evidence, but also policy and decision making. Everyone could do that right now if they chose to in their organisations. And the other big one, which is consistent with the push, there's now work on a national strategy for sort of the support and care economy, and is leverage point 16. So they're all things where I think, as Eve said at the start, all of these are about actually looking more broadly than just early childhood development narrowly defined. It's actually about going, we need to actually, as a system, as a sector, step into and support some of these other movements in Australia that are actually going to deliver the needs we have as well. So aligning around aged care, for example, ironically enough, in reforming or reconceptualising care could be one of those powerful things that the early learning space and early childhood space could do. And so it's really just challenging as well our own silos and our own mental models and our assumptions about where the boundaries are about what change we can make. That's my 2 cents. Others on the panel, feel free to pipe up.
I think place-based approaches were a common thread, and the need to locate leadership and more power in community. And I think that we really need to draw that connection to different models of collaborative leadership, collective impact, etc. And that really has to be at the centre of decision making moving forward. And I think that's one of the ways that we can respond to what we learned were the very unique experiences of each community in how they experience systems, but also the unique strategies that are going to need to be developed in order to respond to those needs as per the specific contexts of those communities. So I think that's a common thread, and I think it's that governments providing more support to collective impact initiatives, backbones, field building intermediaries would really help carry this work forward.
And I think if I can just build on what Bree just said, I think it's also something that really stayed with me through the couple of days was this notion of who has the authority and who has the agency to do the work, make the decisions, be it at a community level or within organisations. I think, and the willingness, which we've spoken about in terms of being able to share that, and where does the responsibility and accountability sit? Because I think, to your point, Fiona, about kind of looking much more broadly than just the ECD system, I think historically we haven't been very good at that. So that's, to me, that's sort of taking all of this work and then throwing it out into the broader sphere to see who else we could be working with and how else we could be working, I think is a really important opportunity. And as you said right at the beginning, here in the here and now in 2023, because it has to be bigger than just government, I think.
So thank you, everyone. We are very much at time. I want to highlight there's some great questions coming through. We will endeavour to respond to those where we've got your email address, but feel free, email backbone@earlyearscatalyst.org.au and we'll try and follow you up individually. From here, we'll be launching the sort of summary report. There'll be an email that'll go out saying this is the summary. We've also got a piece about how the work was done, the structure of it. And then each of those clusters, the deep information with case studies, those will go live. And then we're planning to actually have some sessions longer than this, but a more in-depth session around each of those clusters to actually have conversations specifically around those clusters and to actually generate some prototypes of what do we do with this information, what's already out there, what more could we do, what else could be done. So I think that's really critical. And I just want to highlight this is an ongoing conversation. This is just the first insight. We'd love to continue this conversation with you, and we'll be looking for ways to explore that, but also to say this is a conversation that we want to put out to the field. It's not the Early Years Catalyst's job to hold it, or Orange Compass, or anyone. It's us as the field. And in fact, the idea of the Early Years Catalyst is it's actually lots of people in lots of places doing lots of things. It's not someone that has it written at the bottom of a Zoom screen, or someone who's sitting on the leadership table. It's actually about a lot of people in a lot of places holding it. So that's what the original conception was. So I want to highlight that. We will come through with that. I want to just give you a 1 minute warning, Fiona. I'm going to throw back to you the last question, because I want to end there. Is there anything really substantially different or that really came through that mattered from a First Nations perspective? So I'm going to go and I just want to do my acknowledgements and thanks. And I just want to, in terms of, was there any alternative views or things that made you really think about the work, or the views that experts held or others held that was quite different in terms of that perspective? So, that's something to just pick up on as a final reflection. So in terms of next steps, we'll be popping out on the website. We'll have the deep dives into each of the clusters. We'll advertise those through the email, so make sure you're subscribed through our website. I would now like to just take a moment to thank you all for being here, for making the time to come and listen. Encourage you to get in touch if you've got more questions, you want to have a further conversation. We'd love to do that. Acknowledge our panel, our speakers, Fiona and Eve, Renee and Rebecca, Bree and Nicole, thank you for your time and your input, your energy, your expertise. Deeply, deeply grateful for it. I want to call out my own little team, Bree Hancock from SBA, who's volunteered to drive Zoom. Thank you, Bree, for making it all work. Sally and Michelle, who are wrangling the Q&As and keeping everything on track. So very grateful for your input. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. I'm just quickly scanning through the Q&As to make sure if there might be some that I have missed. Just some congratulations, people acknowledging, lots of how do we do this? How do we do this? So there's lots more conversations to be had. I'll just throw to you, Fiona, as we end. Any highlights that you would make about that kind of alternate perspective that you gained?
I think the key message there really was, as much as we have tried to really dig deeply, think differently, and reframe how we think about leverage points, from a First Nations perspective, there's actually so much more we can keep doing to really unpack our assumptions, our biases, our ways of seeing the system. And it's hard when you're in the system to do that. But every conversation was just full of aha moments going, oh, we haven't even begun to unpack that. So for me, it was just like this amazing excavation of all our assumptions. And we were so grateful for all that time and wisdom that people gave us to really, in some ways, I feel like, he was probably educating us on things we should already know, or we should already be doing. And in some, it was just genuinely, in all of it, it was genuine new learning for us as well. So I feel that challenge and I hold it quite close to my heart, which is we need to go further in. Really, a lot of this is not radical, and there's more we could do to take it even further.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your time. In closing, I want to acknowledge BHP Foundation and Alan and Jill Gray Foundation for funding it. It's just a reality. It doesn't happen without the money. And we're so grateful for being brave enough. And someone highlighted in the questions before, how do we get to moving to these kind of collaborative frameworks? How do we work collectively? How do we work broader? And sometimes it's about funders who are brave enough to fund new things, not just point-to-point programs or kind of specific interventions that they can count 50 people in and 50 people out for one contact hour every week. It's actually saying, let's think differently. And so I just want to call them out for doing that and thank them, acknowledge them. And thank you for being here, for listening, for participating, for contributing your expertise, your participation. And yeah, if you'd like to be in contact, please do. earlyyearscatalyst.org.au is our website. Contact us on the bottom of the page. Love to have a conversation. Look forward to having further conversations with you, members of our leadership table, our co-chairs, Jane and Penny from the Front Project Racy. Look forward to talking with you and just having those deeper conversations. So thank you very much, and have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much.
Have we paused recording?